These are your populations notes, and we'll start right off the bat by redefining a population. Remember, that's a group of organisms of the same species that live together. And again, populations are the things that change over time in terms of evolution. Remember, individuals live or die, but populations are the level of organization that you can measure the change in allele frequencies over time. And there are there are three characteristics of populations that we're going to talk about. The first is geographic distribution. That's just the range or the area where individuals live. It could be longitude, latitude, how far from the equator, what part of the continent, which continents. It could be altitude. How far up the mountain do you have to go before you encounter a certain species of spruce, right? All of that counts as geographic distribution. The density is how dense, how many individuals are living in a specific unit of area, like per acre or per hectare or per square mile. And the growth rate is the number of individuals in a population and how it fluctuates, increases or decreases over time. So for population growth, there are a number of factors that affect it, including the birth and the death rate, right? Birth rate will increase population size, so I have a little plus sign. Death rate will obviously detract from a population size, but then the number of individuals entering, so immigrating into the population, will obviously increase it as well. And then the number leaving will decrease it. So it's the sum of all of these factors that influence the growth rate of a given population. Types of growth involve what's called the exponential or the J curve and the logistical S curve, which we'll do in a second. So the exponential growth curve is J-shaped. It just looks like the letter J, so sometimes you'll see this be referred to as a J-shaped curve. But this is unencumbered, nonstop growth. There's no upper limit here, and the reason there's no upper limit with an exponential growth curve is because there's unlimited resources, which include unlimited space, unlimited mates, no predation, no competition or competitive exclusion, is free reign, basically. And this is not typically a realistic thing because you're going to encounter some limitations at some point in time. You will run out of nutrients, you will run out of space, you will encounter other colonies or bacteria if you're a bacteria. You will encounter predation, right? There's usually something in your environment that limits your growth. So while this might happen for a short amount of time, it's not a sustainable form of growth. But we do like to use bacteria to demonstrate it, at least for a little bit, especially like in a petri dish, because they're given all the nutrients and all the space, and they actually do divide pretty quickly. So you can exhibit exponential growth in populations, but again, for a limited amount of time. The logistical growth curve is much more realistic and much more widely observed. So this is a period of initial slower growth, kind of in this first part. In this middle portion, you've got a period of exponential growth, but then you have slowing growth, and then you have what's called a steady state when you've reached the carrying capacity. So if you look on the y-axis where it says number of whatever, so in this case yeast cells, there's a certain number. This could be 10,000, it could be 60, it could be 4 million, but it's some number of organisms that the environment can sustain, right? That's called the carrying capacity. So if you overshoot it, so if the population is above the carrying capacity, you're going to have things like lack of food, right? Lack of food, lack of space, increased competition. There's a lot of you guys here at this point, whether you're insects or bacteria or whatnot, so there's probably an increase in predation, right? And all of that is going to drive the population back down. Well, then once you're below the carrying capacity, now the environment can support more individuals, so you can lay more eggs, there's a little bit more food, there's more space, etc., so the population increases again. Well, now you're above the carrying capacity and you're experiencing predation, high levels of predation, lack of food, space, increased competition, and your population goes back down. And it's over and over and over again. So when you survey populations in the wild, depending on the species, they're usually in some sort of flux around a carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is unique to the species. So the carrying capacity for oak trees is going to be different than for dandelions, but it's also going to be unique to the ecosystem. It's going to be unique to that particular area and the conditions the area is experiencing, right? If you have a drought, the carrying capacity is going to decrease for a lot of organisms, whereas if you have a heavy rain season, then the carrying capacity for organisms might go up. So it's species specific, it's time specific, it's ecosystem specific. And this is pretty much all saying the same stuff. It's, again, it's kind of shaped like the letter S, kind of like a sideways squished S, but it's called S-shaped. And you guys can just read over this. We've already talked about this though, so I'll pause, or go ahead and pause, jot some of this down, and we'll continue. A summary graph or a summary chart of the graphs that we've talked about. Different types of population growth, again, exponential or logistic. Remember that basically logistic has a portion of it, this first portion, that is exponential, but then after more time, it becomes this kind of falling growth rate that hovers around a carrying capacity. And just be aware of these and be able to describe these, what situations they occur in, and why something like the J curve is unsustainable and why something like the S curve is more realistic. All right. I actually got so ahead of myself that we have already talked about this as well. So go ahead and pause. You can jot some more of this down. This is just talking about the fact that carrying capacities do fluctuate and that it is tied to the environment. So if the environment does change, the carrying capacities can change as well. All right, this is a specific type of relationship. This is called a predator-prey cycle. Sometimes it's called a boom-bust curve, but usually in this case, it's predator-prey. So we've got the rabbit and we've got a fox. So what you're going to notice is that there are two axes here. And actually, well, this one only has one axis, but it's not uncommon to see another y-axis over on the left with the population of the fox. And I'm actually going to erase that. I don't like those being on my screen. Don't know why that was there. But what you're going to see is the prey population, your herbivorous rabbit, is going to peak. It's going to have a maximum population size a little bit before the peak of the predators. This is called a population lag. There's a lag period between the peak of the predator and the peak of the prey. And the peak of the predator is second. It comes after the peak of the prey. And this happens every single time. And I want you to think about why, right? What's going on that's causing the peak in the predator population to be delayed? And there's actually two reasons. The first reason is that the gestation cycle, the amount of time it takes for the predators to give birth is typically longer than it is for the prey animal. These usually reproduce quicker. But another reason is that it's a response to the increase in prey. So basically, you've got an increase in prey that as the number of prey organisms increase, as the number of rabbits increase, it becomes increasingly beneficial to be a fox. There's more and more food, so the fox population rises, right? Well, after a certain point, there's so many foxes that they start to overhunt the rabbits, and the rabbit population is going to drop, right? Well, now there's not enough rabbits to sustain your fox population, so the fox population slowly kind of starves. A lot of individuals die, and now you've got a lower fox population where it's now a good time to be a rabbit because there's not a lot of predators. So then your rabbit population goes back up, and so on and so on and so on, and it kind of cycles in this manner. And so those two things combined get you the kind of graph that looks like this, called your predator-prey cycle graph. So there are no units here. I believe these are supposed to be in the thousands, and this is for the rabbits. And I think the axis for the foxes was supposed to be on the right, but it did get cut off. But we're just going to use the axis right here on the left. What's the carrying capacity for the rabbit population? And you can pause and do the same for the fox. Take a second. So I'm assuming you've thought about it. You might be tempted to say that it's at the top or the bottom of these curves, but remember that we're basically zoomed in to this portion of the graph. So your carrying capacity is roughly going to run right in the middle. So for your rabbits, it's probably somewhere around 2,500. And for your foxes, again, the axis is a little bit off and it's not labeled and got cut off here. So for your foxes, whatever that value over here was, right? But on this axis, it's about 0.75. So that's probably like 775 foxes. That's probably too much, but that's where the carrying capacity is. All right, last two things, factors that limit the growth of populations. There are two types. The first is density dependent, and density dependent factors are basically biotic factors, usually the interaction between organisms. So this includes competition, predation, parasitism, disease. Basically, it depends on how densely your individuals are packed together, right? If you have a disease infecting a major city, like coronavirus in humans, then the sheer number of individuals that are close to each other makes it more likely for that disease to get spread around than it is for a community that lives out in a much more rural area, and there's increased distance between people. So in this case, the number of people and their proximity to each other is a major factor in the spreading of something like a disease. So these are called density dependent factors, and they are pretty much going to be your biotic factors. Contrast that with your density independent factors. So your density independent factors, it does not matter how densely packed the individuals are, they are going to be all equally affected. These are your abiotic factors. So they can be weather events, they can be natural disasters, hurricanes, droughts, etc. Seasonal cycles, human activities count as part of this, pollution, clear cutting forests. It does not matter if you lived by yourself when the drought occurred or whether you lived with 90 other individuals. The drought will affect all of you equally. Same thing if you were a squirrel that lived in a tree and the forest got clear cut, that will affect you regardless of how many other squirrels were also in that area. So again, these are density independent factors and they are abiotic. So I hope this helps, and I will see you later.